Welcome to part 2 of section 1.1 on project management in the context of international sustainable development. In part 1, we were talking about the research-based management and logical framework approaches and how they have enhanced the approaches of project management by focusing now much more on the medium and long-term results to be achieved by the projects. In this regard, the suggested results chain essentially tells us what stakeholders want to achieve, why they want to achieve it, and how they will go about it. So this what and why became a stronger emphasis in the reformulation of project management. The next step was to add performance measures. This was done with a so-called log frame, where the different results are listed in the left column and the performance measures, which are also called the indicators, are presented in the second column. To the indicators, a baseline and a target were added so that monitor and evaluation could be possible in the project. A baseline is in fact a departure point from where the indicator is starting, and a target is what should be achieved. So, for example, if we have the outcome nourishment of children under 5 years old is improved in region X, in country Y, let's say, an indicator would be the number of unnourished children under 5 years old in that certain region. The baseline for it could be, let's say, 15% of the children is currently undernourished. So this 15% is the departure point to which you can measure the achievement of your outcome. The target could be to reduce the situation, this undernourishment situation, by 5% in the next 10 years, with the help of the project, of course. So for each result that you have, let's say for each outcome, you have an indicator for the monitoring and evaluation of that outcome, and you have for this indicator always a baseline and a target. Means of verification are also required in these log frames, and also the assumptions regarding the achievements of these outcomes. We'll come back to these assumptions in a while. And we'll talk as well about these indicators in the course of the later, in more detail. By the time being, I want you to focus again to the log frame as an instrument of this earlier research-based management log framework, logical framework approaches. So this type of matrix became a kind of a mandatory funding requirement with standardized templates that donors imposed on people requiring for funding, people, projects, or agencies. This type of templates kind of allowed a little flexibility regarding the exposition of all the complex issues in a project region. This went a little bit against to the original purpose of such a log frame. They were much more intended to summarize an in-depth participation or discussion with project stakeholders about the goals of the project, about the strategy of the project. The assumptions column was very much in this sense, was originally made, and the intention was that it should be used to analyze these external dependencies that would influence the program's effectiveness. So the program team had to decide whether or not to directly address or mitigate these factors, these risks of the project. Nevertheless, the good intentions in the logical framework matrix, the majority of the projects are still based on very weak log frames. Instead of using it for explaining the complexity of the programs, because of all these standardized templates and lack of space for explaining what are the problems and all these dependencies and conditions, preconditions for the outcomes to unfold, for the results of the project to unfold, this assumptions column became to be used almost as a, let's say, a synthesized, very hard column, very summarized column, without many explanations on the external dependencies and risks of the project. A crude example would be, let's say, policymakers will read the research results. If they do not, the factor is considered to be out of the scope of the project to influence, meaning that the project has delivered the results, but the policymakers, they are not reading the results, so they are not applying the policy changes that we have foreseen, and so results will not be happening. So this will be a very easy way of going around responsibility. These project management approaches had also some other problems, like this type of linear thinking, this type of corporate thinking, such as value for money, meaning that the project clearly concentrated on only the pathway in which they were working on. Like they only dealt with issues that were foreseen in the framework of the project and ignored the big picture, how other actors interacted in the same context through other pathways of change that would as well contribute to possibly the same goals of the project. And by ignoring these other actors and ignoring all other pathways of change, synergies were lost and important interactions that could decide upon the success or failure of projects were ignored. There was a perceived need to explain the impact of aid in more complex terms, and this simplistic approach had led to unrealistic and misleading attempts to quantify the program results. Although this was a milestone in project management, research-based management, and logical framework approaches, this type of linear thinking was still not quite satisfactory, and that's why changes were needed. The results-based management and log frame approach, as they are currently used and were used in the past, they kind of hide what we call the missing middle. There is no clear understanding how change unfolds from the outputs to the outcomes, how the immediate outcomes of a project influence changes at other levels to influence outcomes and impacts in the longer term. So that's where theory of change comes in, which is a way of thinking that can help to bridge this missing middle that the log frame hides, somehow filling this gap, analyzing through a more complex analysis and mapping of people's ideas and theories of stakeholders, steerers, as to the links and iterative processes that underlie the sequence of these outcomes. Why should an outcome unfold in another outcome? What are the preconditions necessary for this to happen? These are all things that are not really addressed in the linear thinking of research-based management, and started to come out with this new revolution of the theory of change. So the mechanisms of change, these basic mechanisms of change, were in fact not enough explained in former theories. Let's say an example. Change in the capacity of extension officers, let's say for agriculture in some developing country. Let's say in the capacity of these extension officers to train farmers in climate-smart agriculture. So if the capacity of extension officers increases, this does not guarantee per se that farmers will adopt these climate-smart technologies. Many other external dependencies may play a crucial role, like the access to credit or the literacy of farmers. These are all factors that needs to be taken into account, that need to be explained. You cannot just say, I have capacitated the extension officers, and the extension officers will deliver training units to the farmers, and the farmers will adopt the technology. This just does not work. You need to explain much more in this missing middle. Why should the farmers adopt these technologies, and what are the factors that could constrain, that could avoid this adoption of these better technologies from the side of the farmers? So here is where theory of change comes in. By going further than this simple linear thinking, by outlining, by building narratives, explanations about the mechanisms of change, why things should change. It is based on a much more comprehensive narrative, like I said, about the assumptions made, about these external dependencies, the risks, about the contexts that support or hinder the theory from being manifested as an observed outcome. So theory of change very much elaborates on the assumptions that was so much simplified in the log frame matrix from former project management approaches. These assumptions are essential. They are beliefs, beliefs that are maybe validated by publications or otherwise transmitted from experience from local stakeholders about the existing conditions that may affect the achievement of the outcomes proposed by the project. So they are necessary conditions that must exist if the relationship in the theory of change that you are drawing are to behave as expected. Rationals explain the underlying logic of the theory of change. They provide evidence about why outcomes are necessary preconditions to outcomes above them. We will work more on these assumptions and rationals further on in the lecture, so I just wanted to introduce you to these concepts a little bit more. We will talk more about examples and you will understand better what are assumptions and rationals in the framework of constructing your own theory of change. There is still not much formal literature on theory of change because it's quite a new approach for project management, but there are interesting introductions that can nevertheless be found, such as that one from Walters or the one from James. So you can find them in the literature, in the references. So theory of change, or the basic characteristic of theory of change, is that it recognizes that change happens in a given context, meaning that theories of change need to have a holistic perspective of the change process. Projects cannot only concentrate on what they can do, they should also concentrate on what others do in that region, on how this influences the assumptions of the projects and the results that the project wants to achieve. Especially, one should search for synergetic influences with the project, synergetic influences arising from the interaction of the project with public policies that are already on course being taken care of in that region, with other projects that are also working on the same problems, with any other actors, private or public, that are working somehow in issues connected to the overarching goal of your project. So in theories of change, change revolves basically not only or basically not around the organization that's implementing the project, but rather revolves much more around the whole range of factors of which the projects are only a small part. Theory of change for project design is then, as we will see in the course of our lecture, it is a top-down approach. It is a top-down approach that allows us to go from the goal that we are seeking to achieve through all the necessary preconditions for achieving this goal. It contains basically all the elements of former project management methods, which we have spoken about before, but the main difference, like I've been repeating now, that theory of change concentrates on explaining the change and not only on the linear structure between activities, outputs, outcomes, impacts, goals, etc. So there will be a graphical representation of all these changes to articulate and to test the causal linkages between all these results. At the end, we will have also a hierarchy of objectives like outputs, outcome, goals, yes, but based on a much more sound background that explains the change that we want to achieve, supported by elaborations on the assumptions, on rationals, and also on a framework of indicators for monitoring and evaluating the project achievements. it will be a much more complex approach that very much settles down on a coherent and well-written narrative on how is change going to be brought about in this results chain of activities, outputs, outcomes. A typical problem tree analysis of theory of change would look like the graphic on the right. It is complex, holistic, looking not only at what the project can deliver, but also looking beyond the project borders to the involving context. What are others doing? How can we find synergies between the work of other projects, between the work of public institutions also striving for the same goals in our project? On the left, you can see the typical linear approach of former project management approaches like the results-based management logical framework approach. It's quite linear, so they concentrate only on the problem that they will be managing to solve, not on the whole context that surrounds that problem. This is a major difference between both approaches. Here you can see the references used for this slide. You have the first ones are on research, results-based management, especially the UNDP work in this field is important for our lecture. You have also very specific logical framework approaches, the one from the European Commission. And then you have the introductory texts on theory of change that I have advised you already in the course of the slides. Take a look at these references and see you in the next lecture. Bye-bye.